The great French writer François de la Rochefoucauld once said, "The accent of one's birthplace," let me try that again without the Elvis Costello glasses. "The accent of one's birthplace remains in the mind and in the heart as in one's speech." Or as my mama might put it, "Honey, you may as well stop scrubbing because that ain't coming out." You will forgive me if my long-lost Southern accent peeks out from under the covers this morning. It has been known to awaken from time to time, particularly when I'm speaking of the South. I'm a Southern boy at heart, coming from Alabama as I do. Sans banjo on my knee, thank you very much. And even though I have lived most of my life in New York City and long since adapted to her big city ways, my Southern roots still reveal themselves from time to time. For example, I believe in the gospel of y'all, a word combining you and all, which is deep in the marrow of every Southerner and ought to be a daily staple in the vocabulary of the rest of y'all. The very idea that you would refer to a group of women as you guys, or even worse, yous guys, is not only a flagrant display of downright ignorance, but it's enough to give what we down south would call a bad case of the all-overs, aka the shivers. I'm also partial to Southern cooking, and by that I do not mean actually cooking so much as I mean actually eating. I might not be able to tell you where all the Southern restaurants are in New York City, but I know where to find a bunch of them, and I can tell you which ones are doing it right. That is, who's putting the sugar in the iced tea where it belongs, and not in the cornbread where it most certainly does not. Nothing brings out the Southerner in me quite like football, specifically college football, and more to the heart of the matter, the University of Alabama Crimson Tide, Roll Tide. As a popular bumper sticker down south reads, "Alabama by birth, Crimson Tide by the grace of God." It's all very spiritual. Southerners know their football, and they demand excellence. Writer Rick Bragg points out, somewhere a regular season loss is not the end of the world, and there are such things as moral victories and good college tries. Not Tuscaloosa, not Baton Rouge, not Auburn, not Athens, not Fayetteville, where they wear rubber pigs on their heads and yell, "Soo-ee." Judges do that. Deacons, florists, presidents. One October, many moons ago, when I thought I was a happily married young man, my wife and I, along with two other couples, all of us transplants from the Deep South, ventured up to Vermont for a weekend of leaf peeping. Because we were all young and naive, we thought what could be better on a crisp autumn Saturday in New England than to watch a football game. So we drove over to Hanover, New Hampshire to watch the Big Green of Dartmouth tackle the Harvard Crimson. Here's all I have to say about Ivy League football. Bless their hearts. I guess they mean well, but it's almost sacrilegious. Roy Blunt, a fellow Southerner from the equally football-mad state of Georgia, once compared the annual Harvard-Yale game to watching a panel discussion. He takes no interest whatsoever in what passes in the North for college sports, saying, when all you can follow in the local media are Lehigh or knee-high or whatever, why bother? But life isn't all touchdowns and sweet tea, even for those New Yorkers born with a Southern heart. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. There are days when being a Southern expatriate living north of the Mason-Dixon line means always having to say you're sorry. I don't know if this has been the experience of all my fellow refugees, but it can sometimes seem as if those of us born with an extra diphthong or two in our mouths are greeted at the city gates with a Metro card and a hair shirt and called upon to explain the historical sins and egregious behavior of an entire region. Take the Civil War, please. I didn't fight in the Civil War. About the closest I've ever come to the Civil War was attending Jefferson Davis High School in Montgomery, Alabama. Once a year, our football team, the Jefferson Davis Volunteers, would play our crosstown rivals, the Generals of Robert E. Lee High School. But that's it. I don't participate in any Civil War battle reenactments. I've never been near a plantation. Outside of Hard Times Come Again No More, I don't, as a rule, go around singing Stephen Foster songs. But if you mention the Civil War, for some reason, perhaps because I was born in Alabama, the heart of Dixie, as our license plates used to display, I feel like I owe somebody an apology. Part of the problem is we Southerners just don't get good press. You can look at the front page of the New York Times today for a perfect example. When was the last time you read anything positive about the South in the New York Times? I can tell you about the only time you'll read about Alabama in the Times is when some county judge nails the 10 Commandments to the courthouse walls and then gets himself elected to the Alabama Supreme Court. Or a headline such as this one, which appeared in the Times a number of years ago: Alabama marriage age raised from 14 to 16. Thank you, all the news that's fit to print. It's no wonder I feel guilty. I'm not getting any positive reinforcement. 14-year-old brides and grooms, 10 commandment-hugging judges, and an alma mater named after the president of Dixie. What's an Alabama boy living in the Big Apple to do? Where am I supposed to go to feel better about my native South? Where, I ask you? Where? Well, I'll tell you where. Eudora, Welty. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to start no fights with any of you Yankees here this morning. But when it comes to American literature over the last 100 years or so, the South has kicked your ass. And I'll let you in on a little secret. It wasn't even close. Listen to a few of these names: William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Zora Neale Hurston, Lee Smith, Fred Chappell, Ellen Gilchrist, Alice Walker, Thomas Wolfe, Tom Wolfe, Ellen Douglas, Tony Early, Carson McCullers, Walker Percy, Reynolds Price, Peter Taylor, Richard Ford, Truman Capote, Donna Tartt, Richard Bausch, Doris Betts, Clyde Edgerton, David Sedaris, James Agee, Lillian Hellman, Barry Hanna, Willie Morris, Elizabeth Spencer, Bobby Ann Mason, Larry Brown, Richard Wright, Tennessee Williams, Beth Henley, Shelby Foote, Rick Bass, Rick Bragg, Russell Baker, James Dickey, William Styron, Horton Foote, Robert Penn Warren, Marcia Norman, James Weldon Johnson, Ernest Gaines, Barbara Kingsolver, George C. Wolfe, Dorothy Allison, Wendell Berry, Will Campbell, Charles Wright, James Still, T.R. Pearson, Gail Godwin, Alan Gurganus, Cormac McCarthy, Jill McCorkle, Bailey White, John Kennedy Toole, Pat Conroy, Fannie Flagg, Erskine Caldwell, Tom Robbins, Ann Rice, Harry Cruz, Daniel Wallace, Larry McMurtry, Maya Angelou, Ann Patchett, Molly Ivins, Melinda Haynes, Mark Childress, Terry K., Roy Blunt Jr., and last but not least, Harper Lee. And those are just a few of our good ones. One would be hard-pressed to find anyone who considers himself much of a reader, who hasn't been influenced, who doesn't continue to be influenced by at least one or two of the names that I just read. That all of these writers were either born and or raised in the South speaks to the very nature of the South as a hothouse for great storytelling. But this little speech of mine is not entitled Happy with Harper Lee, Fainting over Faulkner, or Cuckoo for Capote. This speech is entitled Adoring Eudora and is meant to pay tribute to one of the finest storytellers this country has ever produced, and the absolute queen bee of Southern writers, Eudora Welty. Now let me just state right up front that I am no Eudora Welty scholar, but as someone who has read much of her work, I tend to get a little gaga when it comes to singing her praises, and I'm hardly alone. Ms. Welty has often been called the Jane Austen of American letters, and her work Chekhovian, as compelling as that of Proust, equal to Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Shakespeare. And in reviewing her collected stories, Mary Lee Settle proclaimed Eudora the finest Mozartian stylist writing in the English language. Mozartian. Now that's gaga. I have my personal favorites of all of her writings, and if you're presently searching for something to read, I could recommend a few of her short stories, beginning with Why I Live at the P.O., A Worn Path, or Petrified Man. But if I were your English teacher, the required reading for this course would have to include her 1972 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Optimist's Daughter. The Optimist's Daughter is a masterpiece. It is the story of Laurel McKelvey Hand, a woman in her mid-40s, struggling to come to terms with the deaths of all those she has loved and lost in her life. Her mother, her father, and her husband Phil, who was killed in World War II. At one point in the novel, Laurel remembers a train ride she took with her then fiance Phil from Chicago, Illinois, down to Mount Salis, Mississippi, where they were to be married. Miss Welty writes, "When they were climbing the long approach to a bridge after leaving Cairo, rising slowly higher until they rode above the tops of bare trees, she looked down and saw the pale light widening and the river bottoms opening out, and then the water appearing, reflecting the low early sun. There were two rivers. Here was where they came together. This was the confluence of the waters, the Ohio and the Mississippi. They were looking down from a great elevation, and all they saw was at the point of coming together, the bare trees marching in from the horizon, the rivers moving into one. And as he touched her arm, she looked up with him and saw the long, ragged, pencil-faint line of birds flying in a V of their own, following the same course down. All they could see was sky, water, birds, light, and confluence. It was the whole morning world. And they themselves were part of the confluence. Their own joint act of faith had brought them here at the very moment and marched in occurrence and proceeded as it proceeded. Direction itself was made beautiful, momentous. They were riding as one with it right up front. It's our turn, she thought exultantly, and we're going to live forever." Now, some of you may be saying to yourself, okay, enough already. The girl can write. But what does any of this have to do with the Holy Spirit? Well, I'll admit it is a bit of a stretch. And Lord knows if Eudora were here right now, she'd probably give me a good smack upside the back of the head for implying there's any connection whatsoever. Still, I find myself drawn to that one word Ms. Welty used repeatedly throughout the passage I just read, confluence, a noun, meaning a flowing together of two or more streams, the point of juncture of such streams, the combined stream formed by this juncture, a tributary. Of course, confluence needn't have anything to do with water. It can be a meeting place and the new power that emerges from that point of coming together. Confluence is not a religious word. You won't find it anywhere in the Bible. And yet, the stories of our faith, like you saw this morning, are filled with moments of confluence, the place or point in time in which God and human beings come together. For Moses, it was a burning bush. For Elijah, a still small voice. For Mary, it was the angel Gabriel saying, "Blessed art thou among women." And as Azalea read to us this morning, for Jesus' disciples, holed up in a room, bewildered and bereft at the recent death of their leader, it was a rushing mighty wind, tongues of fire, and the Apostle Peter addressing a crowd, "Hola, Jerusalén, ¿cómo están ustedes? Me llamo Pedro. ¿Qué? ¿Estoy hablando español? No. Les juro no que haya bebido nada. Hello, Jerusalem, how are you? My name is Peter. What? I'm speaking Spanish? No, I haven't been drinking." We moderns tend to look back on these ancient stories of confluence in slack-jawed amazement, amazed that anyone would try and pull this much wool over our eyes. We're used to miracles, but on a much smaller scale, like being able to find a seat on a rush hour 4 train, or being able to get a ticket to a Bruce Springsteen concert. Now that's a miracle. When you start talking about burning bushes and voices on the wind and angels and tongues of fire, each a divine encounter with all the subtlety of a roadrunner anvil to Wile E. Coyote's cranium, we're left muttering to ourselves, where is that God? Where is our burning bush? Where is the angel who comes to whisper in our ear, "Blessed art thou"? The writer Annie Dillard says, a blur of romance clings to our notions of these Sunday school watercolor figures who are purely themselves in their tattered robes, while we now are various and complex. The details of their stories are told with such imagination and grace that we mistake vision for history, dream for description, and we fancy that life has devolved. And for the time being, Miss Dillard writes, there were no formally heroic times, and there was no formally pure generation. There's no one here but us chickens, and so it has always been. It's a weakening and discoloring idea that rustic people knew God personally once upon a time, but that it's too late for the rest of us. In fact, the absolute is available to everyone in every age. There never was a more holy age than ours, and there never was a less. Each and every day, the divine voice issues from Sinai, says the Talmud. So where is that God? Where that God has always been. Not far from each one of us, as Apostle Paul says, but where you and I live and move and have our being. Our faith is not dependent upon miracle stories of millenniums past, but upon that single word used by Eudora Welty, confluence. For faith is found within the confluence of our lives and the Spirit of the living God. That such a place might exist must surely be all the miracle we would ever need. With thanks and apologies to Eudora Welty, once again from the Optimist Order. And they themselves were part of the confluence. Their own joint act of faith had brought them here at the very moment and matched its occurrence and proceeded as it proceeded. Direction itself was made beautiful, momentous. They were riding as one with it right up front. It's our turn, and we're going to live forever. Amen.